Helen Cross thought she had seen every kind of evil in her career, but nothing prepared her for the 9-year game of shadows orchestrated by Victor Dane, a vanished filmmaker turned serial killer who cast his victims like characters in a living screenplay and used real blood to write his final act. In 2012, Maple Hollow was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. A small town nestled between forested hills and quiet highways, it was known more for its friendly community than for any real excitement. The most thrilling event in recent memory had been a local bake-off. That all changed on the evening of October 17th, when Claire Monroe disappeared without a trace. Claire was 29 years old, a nurse at Maple Hollow Regional Hospital. She lived alone in a small 2-bedroom cottage at the edge of town. Known for her warm smile and calm demeanor, Claire had no enemies. Her life was simple and routine. She went to work, volunteered on weekends, and took long walks in the forest preserve. That evening she clocked out from her shift at 6:45 p.m. Security cameras showed her walking through the parking lot, waving at a colleague. She got into her silver sedan and drove off. That was the last time anyone saw her. The next morning, Claire's co-workers grew concerned when she didn't show up for her shift. She was never late, never missed a day without notice. Phone calls went unanswered. By noon, her supervisor contacted the police. Within hours, officers found Claire's car parked at the entrance to Pine Ridge Trail, a hiking path she often visited. The vehicle was locked, keys left in the ignition. Her purse was on the passenger seat, untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no damage to the car, and no footprints leading away. It was as if she had stepped out of the car and vanished into the air. A full-scale search was launched. Police, volunteers, and K-9 units combed the surrounding woods. Helicopters circled overhead. For days, they scoured the area, searching for any hint of Claire's whereabouts. Nothing turned up. No torn clothing, no phone, no body. The trail itself showed no signs of recent passage beyond what was expected for a public space. It became clear that if Claire had gone into those woods, she had left no trace behind. As news of the disappearance spread, theories began to circulate. Some believed Claire had suffered a mental breakdown and wandered off into the wilderness. Others thought she had been kidnapped. A few whispered about someone from her past, an ex-boyfriend, a disgruntled patient, or even a stalker. But no concrete suspects emerged. Claire had no history of mental illness, no recent breakups, no visible threats. Her digital life revealed nothing suspicious. No strange messages, no calls from unknown numbers, no visits to unusual websites. Everything about her life seemed painfully normal. Detectives interviewed friends, family, neighbors, and co-workers. Everyone said the same thing. Claire was kind, stable, and had no reason to disappear. Her house was exactly as she had left it, laundry half folded, dinner ingredients still on the kitchen counter. Her dog, Daisy, had been left without food, another sign she hadn't planned to be away for long. There was no goodbye note, no evidence of a plan to flee. The police were baffled. Weeks passed, then months. Leads dried up, tips slowed. The public lost interest. The case file thickened, filled with dead ends and possibilities that went nowhere. By early 2013, the search was scaled back. Claire Monroe's disappearance joined the long list of unsolved mysteries, stored away in a box labeled Missing Persons. But for those who knew her, especially her mother, Margaret Monroe, the pain never dulled. She put up flyers, started a website, gave interviews, and begged anyone with information to come forward. Still, silence. Then, something strange happened. In May 2014, another person vanished in a nearby town called Eastwood, about 40 miles from Maple Hollow. The victim, 32-year-old Matthew Green, was a civil engineer with a quiet life. He lived alone, had no known enemies, and disappeared just like Claire. His car was found outside a library, keys in the ignition, personal belongings untouched. Again, no struggle, no evidence, no reason. Police noted the similarities but stopped short of linking the cases. After all, people went missing all the time, right? Over the next 2 years, 2 more disappearances occurred. One was a school counselor, named Nina Brooks, last seen getting gas in the town of Elmridge. The other was Aaron Price, a 45-year-old accountant who failed to show up for a weekend retreat with friends. In both cases, vehicles were found in public spaces, no signs of violence, and no indication of what had happened. Each case occurred within a 70-mile radius of Maple Hollow. Each person lived a quiet, predictable life, and, as investigators would later discover, each one had received an anonymous handwritten letter shortly before they vanished. At the time, this detail went unnoticed. The letters were seen by families as odd but unimportant. Some didn't report them at all. Others assumed they were junk mail or simple pranks. It wasn't until much later that police realized the letters were a key piece of the puzzle. The letters were short, written in elegant cursive, and contained cryptic messages like, "We see you," or "The world is watching." No return address, no fingerprints, nothing traceable. They were the only connection between the victims, but by the time this link was made, the trail had already gone cold. Back in Maple Hollow, Claire Monroe's case sat untouched in a filing cabinet. Investigators had moved on. New crimes needed solving. Budget constraints limited cold case reviews. But what no one realized was that something much bigger was happening, something carefully planned, deeply orchestrated, and terrifying in scope. Someone had been watching. Someone had selected Claire and the others with purpose. And the police had no idea that for every month they searched the wrong path. The true mastermind was pulling strings behind the curtain, always staying one step ahead. Claire's disappearance was not a one-off tragedy. It was the opening move in a game that would take nearly a decade to unfold. A game designed by someone who understood not only how to kill, but how to control every move that followed. And the first move had already worked perfectly. By late 2015, the authorities had 4 disappearances on their hands, all within a short radius of each other, and all seemingly disconnected. Yet despite different backgrounds and locations, a disturbing pattern had begun to form, a pattern so subtle it took years before anyone noticed it. Each missing person case shared a chilling calmness, a calculated quiet. There were no frantic last messages, no signs of a struggle, no digital alarms triggered by panicked actions. These people simply vanished. The first time someone suggested the cases might be connected, it was brushed aside. There was no physical evidence, no forensic overlap, no apparent link between the victims. But for Helen Cross, a retired FBI profiler, with decades of experience studying serial offenders, something about the cases didn't sit right. After reading a short article about the disappearance of Aaron Price, the 4th known victim, she saw echoes of something familiar: the precision, the lack of chaos, the silence that followed each case. It felt too clean to be real. Cross requested files on the earlier cases and noticed something instantly. All of the missing individuals had recently been featured in a little-known documentary series titled Everyday Shadows, a local true crime project that highlighted ordinary people with extraordinary stories. The series had aired online through a small production company that folded shortly after releasing its final episode. Each subject had appeared on camera, speaking candidly about their lives, where they lived, what frightened them, what routines they followed. It was raw and personal, presented under the guise of sharing strength through vulnerability. Helen began to think about what that kind of footage would look like to the wrong person, not just as entertainment, but as a playbook. Each person had unknowingly handed over details that, in the right hands, could be weaponized. One victim had spoken about walking the same trail every Friday at dusk to unwind. Another had described never locking their back door because no one around here would ever break in. One spoke about suffering from sleep paralysis and how they sometimes woke up unable to move or speak. They thought they were offering relatable insights. In truth, they were revealing their weaknesses. It became clear that the disappearances weren't random. The victims had been selected, watched, and taken. Whoever was behind this had patience and precision. He didn't just study routines, he studied psychology. He knew how to make people feel safe, how to lure them into their comfort zone before pulling them out of existence. By now, local police were growing defensive. No department wanted to admit they had missed something this critical. Some denied that the documentary could be related at all. They saw it as a coincidence, an unfortunate overlap. But Cross kept digging. She acquired archived copies of the documentary episodes and watched them all, repeatedly. There was a tone to them, something strange beneath the surface. The episodes were oddly edited, not in a flashy or sloppy way, but with an eerie stillness. Certain frames lingered too long. Certain phrases were replayed with subtle changes in audio pitch. Cross noticed how each segment ended with a brief black screen and a soft chime that felt out of place. This wasn't just a documentary. It was a tool. Eventually, she traced the project to a small production label known only as Dark Current Films. The label had no official staff listings, no public address, and no functioning website. When she looked at the copyright metadata, she found a name, Victor Lane. There were no photographs, no social media profiles, no recent activity under that name. The only record of Victor Lane was a single interview given to a local paper in 2011 where he discussed his dream of telling stories that make people look inward. After that, nothing. As she searched deeper, Cross uncovered something more disturbing. Every episode of Everyday Shadows had one thing in common. Though the hosts changed and locations varied, the camera work remained the same. Smooth, deliberate, almost hypnotic. It became apparent that the person behind the camera had a specific vision. The victims weren't just participants. They were being cataloged. Their faces, their movements, their words. It was all being recorded with a level of focus that suggested something more than artistic interest. Around the same time, another discovery added to the growing dread. Police had recovered one of the original handwritten letters sent to a victim, one that the family had kept. It had been stored away in a drawer, almost forgotten. The ink had faded slightly, but the paper was intact. Forensics revealed no fingerprints, but there was something else. Impressions from earlier writing showed faint outlines of another message on the sheet underneath. It appeared to be a list. Several names were visible: Claire Monroe, Matthew Green, Nina Brooks, and two more names, unfamiliar and not yet connected to any reported case. This changed everything. It meant the killer had a plan, a sequence, possibly a timeline. Yet, even with this insight, the police had no suspect, no clear motive, and no understanding of how the victims were being taken. There were no witnesses, No security footage ever showed anyone approaching the victims. No financial activity suggested a purchase of equipment or tools. Whoever this was had erased themselves from the digital world. Cross became convinced that this was the work of someone who saw himself not as a killer, but as a creator. Someone who was constructing a narrative and saw the police as unwilling characters in his story. Every clue they found had been left for them to find. Nothing more, nothing less. The handwritten letters weren't just warnings. They were invitations. Signals that the next act was about to begin. It wasn't long before she voiced her theory to law enforcement. This isn't a man hunting for victims. This is a man building a performance. He's not committing crimes to escape detection. He's committing them to be seen, just not too clearly, just enough to keep the audience guessing. Despite her warnings, the investigation remained fractured. Each town had its own jurisdiction. Resources were limited. Cooperation was slow. And through it all, the disappearances continued, with long gaps in between. The killer had no urgency. He wasn't rushed. That, Cross said, made him far more dangerous, because he wasn't chasing the thrill of killing. He was chasing the thrill of control. He had turned real lives into episodes, real people into props. And worse, he had trapped the police into playing their parts without knowing they were in the show. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a story someone was writing in real time, and no one knew how many chapters were left. In early 2017, the pressure on law enforcement was rising. Public confidence was eroding as whispers of a serial predator working across county lines spread through communities. Officially, the cases were still considered separate investigations, but more people were beginning to draw their own conclusions. 4 victims had vanished over 5 years. All had clean records, peaceful lives, and all were featured in the same obscure documentary that now seemed cursed by association. Then, it happened again. On the evening of February 2nd, Eli Garner, a 34-year-old middle school teacher, failed to arrive for dinner with his sister. She waited at the restaurant for almost an hour before calling him, but the call went straight to voicemail. That was unusual. Eli was responsible, punctual, and deeply connected to his family. When he didn't return home that night, she reported him missing the next morning. Police began their search immediately. His car was found parked 2 blocks from his apartment in the town of Redbridge. Again, it was locked. His phone was inside, placed neatly on the passenger seat. Nothing was stolen, and nothing seemed disturbed. It was the 5th case with the same eerie pattern. No forced entry, no struggle, no signs of life. But this time, there was a sliver of hope. A security camera mounted on a nearby grocery store caught a shadowy figure walking past Eli's building 2 nights before his disappearance. The figure limped slightly and moved with a deliberate pace, dressed in dark clothing. The footage was blurry and grainy, but for the first time, there was a potential lead. Detectives pored over the footage frame by frame, trying to isolate any defining features. The person's face remained obscured by a hood, but the limp stood out. Using gait analysis software and cross-referencing it with medical records, local authorities began searching for anyone in the area with a similar physical condition. After weeks of combing through data, one name surfaced: Mark Keller. Keller was a 42-year-old former videographer who had withdrawn from public life. He lived alone in a cabin on the outskirts of Redbridge. A car accident 6 years earlier had left him with permanent damage to his left leg, explaining the limp. Keller also had a background in independent film, which caught investigators' attention immediately. When police visited Keller's residence, they found it quiet and orderly. The man answered the door calmly but seemed anxious. Upon searching the property, investigators uncovered various pieces of film equipment, tripods, lights, hard drives, and a stack of DVDs, some of which matched the visual style of Everyday Shadows. What startled detectives most was a drawer containing handwritten notes. The names of several missing persons appeared on those pages, alongside observations and phrases from their documentary episodes. It looked like the case had cracked open. Keller was arrested on suspicion of abduction and held for questioning. News spread like wildfire. For the first time in years, the public exhaled. The boogeyman, it seemed, had a name and a face. News anchors described Keller as a loner with a disturbing obsession. Articles claimed he had a dark past and a fascination with control. The narrative was easy to believe, but behind the scenes, Helen Cross wasn't convinced. The evidence felt too easy, too staged. Keller had no history of violence, no criminal record, and had never shown signs of erratic behavior. His film equipment looked old and unused. The notes found in his drawer were peculiar, as if someone had written them while pretending to be him. And then there was the most troubling part. The handwriting on the notes did not match the handwriting from the letters sent to the victims. Cross pushed the Redbridge PD to take another look. She requested that Keller's devices be forensically analyzed. What came back stunned investigators. None of the files on his hard drives had been accessed in the last 3 years. The DVDs, while similar in tone to Everyday Shadows, were unconnected. The handwriting on the victim list was inconsistent with other samples of Keller's writing. Even the security footage, once believed to show him walking past Eli's apartment, began to seem questionable. The timestamp was off by 27 minutes, and the limp, while similar, didn't quite match Keller's gait when compared frame by frame. Then came the final blow. 2 weeks into Keller's incarceration, another person vanished. Her name was Lisa Hunt, a librarian from the nearby town of Glenmere. She was last seen leaving her workplace late on a Friday evening. Her car was found the next morning in a church parking lot, locked, personal items intact, keys on the dashboard, just like the others. And days later, her sister came forward with something else. A strange letter Lisa had received the week before she disappeared. It bore the same graceful, haunting cursive that had appeared in previous cases. It was undeniable. The real perpetrator was still out there. Suddenly, everything shifted. The police had arrested the wrong man. The media narrative collapsed. And whoever the actual mastermind was, he had just demonstrated that not even a high-profile arrest could interrupt his plan. If anything, it made him more dangerous. Mark Keller was quietly released, though his name remained permanently scarred by the accusations. He returned to his isolated life, unwilling or unable to speak about the ordeal. Meanwhile, Cross went back to the drawing board. The killer had planned every move meticulously. He had planted false evidence. He had left traces, leading directly to a believable scapegoat. He wanted Keller to be caught, knowing the real game would continue while the world looked away. The realization settled in with terrifying clarity. This was no ordinary predator. This was someone who saw law enforcement not as an obstacle, but as part of the story. He was writing the investigation as much as the crimes. The framing of Keller had been intentional, calculated, and flawless. Cross no longer saw this as a serial killer case. She began to see it for what it truly was. Long-form performance, a real-life script written by someone with an obsessive understanding of narrative structure and emotional manipulation. Each disappearance was an act. Each police failure, a twist. Each recovered clue, a red herring carefully placed for dramatic timing. The killer was directing everything, and the police, despite their best efforts, were trapped in his script, reacting to scenes he had already written. He was always ahead, always watching, and with each passing year, the story only got darker. By the beginning of 2019, the investigation had stalled again. After the misstep with Mark Keller, law enforcement agencies across the region were reluctant to act too quickly, fearful of another public embarrassment. Confidence in the task force crumbled, and resources began to dry up. Tips poured in, but most were the result of paranoia or attention-seeking. The killer, meanwhile, had gone quiet. For nearly a year there were no known disappearances. It gave the illusion of calm, but those closest to the case knew better. This wasn't a pause. It was the planning stage for whatever came next. Helen. Cross was still working quietly in the background. After years of following dead ends and false leads, she began shifting her focus from the victims to the killer himself. Not who he was, but how he thought. If he saw himself as a creator, a storyteller, then his work must follow a structure. She pulled dozens of popular screenwriting books from her shelves, analyzing plot arcs, timing, and narrative tension. Her theory was unsettling. The killer was building a 5-act story, not just in fiction, but in reality. And if she was right, Act 4, the spiral toward the climax, was about to begin. In late September, a new clue surfaced, not through the police, but through a college student named Emma Rowe. Emma had been working on a media studies thesis and stumbled upon a peculiar video posted anonymously to a deep web archive. The footage was simple: 30 minutes of an empty wooden chair placed in the center of a dimly lit room. At first glance, it seemed like experimental art, but near the end of the video, text flickered on the screen. "You stopped watching, so we started writing." The final frame lingered longer than the others and showed a photograph tacked to the wall behind the chair. It was blurry, but Emma recognized the face. It was Lisa Hunt, the last confirmed victim. Emma reported the video to campus security, who forwarded it to the police. The footage was quickly authenticated. It had not been edited. The timestamp, encoded in the metadata, placed its creation just 4 days before the video was discovered. It hadn't been left online by mistake. It had been uploaded deliberately and offering. And the phrase on the screen wasn't just eerie, it was accusatory. Someone was angry that the world had moved on. The killer wanted attention again. The discovery reinvigorated the investigation. Forensic analysts scoured the video frame by frame. They enhanced the audio and uncovered a faint background sound, a rhythmic ticking, too fast for a clock, but too slow for mechanical equipment. Some believed it was a metronome. Others thought it was the tapping of fingers on wood. Either way, it was intentional. Cross believed it was a countdown of sorts. A warning. 2 weeks later, the killer struck again. The victim was 38-year-old Hayden Wells, a therapist and father of 2. He disappeared while on a solo hiking trip in Ravenfield National Park. His car was located at the trailhead with his phone turned off and his backpack in the trunk. For once, investigators caught a break. A ranger's trail camera, placed to monitor wildlife, captured a fleeting shot of someone walking behind Hayden on the trail. The image was distant and grainy, but it clearly showed a person in a long coat, carrying what appeared to be a camera tripod. This time, the task force mobilized faster. Search crews descended on the park, canvassing miles of trails and camping grounds. They found no trace of Hayden, but they did find something else. A memory card placed in a plastic bag wedged into the hollow of a tree. On the card was a video, short, silent, and disturbing. It showed Hayden sitting on the ground, his eyes wide with fear. Behind him, unseen hands adjusted the camera focus. The final frame showed Hayden looking directly into the lens. Then the screen cut to black. It was the most direct footage they had ever received. Unlike the previous messages, this one had no cryptic phrases, no clever twists. It was raw documentation, unfiltered, clinical. The killer was escalating, dropping the mask of the storyteller and becoming something more primal. Or perhaps this too was part of the narrative. Act 4 was traditionally the darkest part of any story, the point where the hero loses everything, and the villain tightens his grip. If that was true, then what came next would be worse. Cross feared the killer was preparing his final act. The sudden re-emergence, the messages, the video evidence, they were breadcrumbs leading toward an endgame. But what was the climax? What was he building toward? He had taken 7 lives that they knew of. He had taunted the police, misled the public, and played with perception. And now, after years of silence, he was pulling the audience back in for the final scene. Desperate for new insight, Cross requested access to all previously dismissed evidence. Among the items overlooked during the original investigation was a damaged camcorder recovered from a pawn shop in Eastwood in 2013, sold under a false name. The footage on the device had been deemed corrupted and never reviewed. Using modern recovery software, Cross and a digital forensics team managed to retrieve part of a single video. What they saw left them speechless. The video showed a woman tied to a chair in a dim room. Her mouth was taped, her eyes wide with confusion and panic. The footage was silent, but her fear was unmistakable. In the background, standing just at the edge of the frame, was a figure wearing a black mask and holding a script. He never spoke. He simply flipped through pages, reading silently as the woman wept. The timestamp on the file aligned with the day Claire Monroe disappeared. It confirmed what Cross had long suspected. Claire had been the first, and her death had been documented. The killer had kept recordings, trophies, not for gratification, but for structure. He was creating a film, one that only he had access to. It wasn't about headlines or legacy. It was about capturing fear, rehearsing control, and filming the collapse of normal life. Cross now knew the truth. This wasn't a serial killer in the traditional sense. It was a director working on his magnum opus. Each victim had been cast. Each disappearance was a scene. And now, with the world watching again, he was preparing the final act. But there was one question that no one could answer. How? Does a story like this end? And who, if anyone, had been cast as the last character? In early 2020, a sense of unease blanketed the region. The recent footage of Hayden Wells had circulated quietly among law enforcement and select media, withheld from public release at Helen Cross's request. She believed the killer wanted the world to react, to panic, to feed the drama of his narrative. Denying him the satisfaction of that stage was one of the few ways to disrupt his rhythm. But even in silence, the tension grew. People whispered. Online forums speculated. And the task force, now restructured and re-energized, worked around the clock. Cross reviewed every case again, this time searching for what connected the victims beyond their appearances in everyday shadows. She mapped their lives, traced their routines, cross-checked old interviews, work histories, phone records, everything. It felt impossible that someone could have orchestrated such a calculated, drawn-out series of abductions without ever slipping. Yet whoever this was, they hadn't made a single provable mistake. Then, during a routine audit of background checks related to the show, Cross found something odd. A production assistant listed on Season 1 episodes had no digital footprint before. 2011. No tax records, no social media, no education or health history. The name, Jonas Clive, had been used only on a handful of internal crew lists. He wasn't in any official credits, and the only existing photograph was from a blurry behind-the-scenes image posted to an old cast blog. It showed a man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses crouching behind a lighting rig. Cross followed the trail. After digging into invoices and payment ledgers, she discovered that Jonas Clive had been paid in cash through a shell company connected to a freelance editing firm. The firm had folded shortly after Season 1 wrapped. That led her to an address, a defunct storage unit in the industrial district of Hollow Creek. It had been registered under Clive's alias and hadn't been accessed in years. A warrant was quickly issued. Inside the storage unit, investigators found boxes of old film reels, hard drives, and notebooks. One wall had been covered in thumbtacked photographs, each victim carefully placed in chronological order with notes scribbled beneath. But more disturbing were the gaps, several spaces left blank, labeled only with vague terms like fall or reunion. Cross realized with horror that these weren't just records of past victims. They were placeholders for future ones. Among the recovered items was a large trunk secured with a padlock. Inside, wrapped in plastic and lined with foam, was an 8mm film projector. Alongside it was a reel labeled Finale, Rough Cut. They transported the contents to a secure facility and set up a private screening. No one was prepared for what followed. The film began with a slow montage of landscapes, empty streets, schoolyards at dusk, rain-drenched sidewalks. Then it shifted to faces, victims from earlier cases filmed during surveillance. Some of the footage appeared to have been taken months, even years before their abductions. The killer had been watching them long before making contact. He had stalked and studied them until their routines became predictable, until their presence in the documentary seemed like fate instead of manipulation. As the reel continued, the imagery grew darker. Short clips showed interior spaces, a cellar, a small room with padded walls, a recording studio stripped of equipment. There were glimpses of chairs, restraints, a tripod standing in the center of the frame. The footage cut erratically, occasionally, returning to shots of highways, forests, or distant cityscapes. Interwoven were handwritten title cards, each one styled like an old silent film. Act 1, Discovery. Act 2, Conflict. Act 3, Silence. Act 4, Descent. The final card read simply, Act Fee, Resolution. Then the reel ended. No body, no confession, no identity. But the message was clear. The killer was almost done. Cross felt something tighten inside her. The storage unit had been his vault, his editing bay, his archive. But it wasn't abandoned by mistake. It had been left as a message. He wanted it to be found. He wanted them to know the end was coming. And the scariest part was, they still didn't know who he was. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the Redbridge police station. It had no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Helen Cross, taken from a distance as she walked to her car. On the back was a handwritten note. Even the best actors forget their lines. That changed everything. Security was increased. Cross was placed under protective detail, but she refused to be sidelined. She knew now that she had become part of the killer's final act. She was the investigator, the foil, the last character on the board. The killer had been constructing this narrative with obsessive precision, And he had always intended for someone to survive, to bear witness to his story and carry it forward. She pushed her team harder, retracing every step. She began focusing, not on the victims, but on the camera work. The lighting, the angles, the motion, all of it was too refined. This wasn't a self-taught amateur. It was someone with professional experience, possibly even a mentor in the film world. She started cross-referencing film school rosters, obscure film festival entries, and forgotten local productions from the early 2000s. One name resurfaced again and again in the footnotes: Victor Dane. Dane had once been a respected avant-garde filmmaker. He taught briefly at a community college before disappearing from the industry after a controversial short film caused outrage at a local festival. He had never been charged with anything, but several students had accused him of creating an unsafe environment, manipulating them into disturbing projects, and filming without consent. He vanished shortly after. His last known address was 2 towns over from where the first victim disappeared. Armed with a search warrant, the task force raided a cabin registered under a pseudonym. Inside, they found the final piece. A room set, up like a theater stage, with a single chair under a spotlight. The walls were covered with storyboards, each one capturing a moment in the killer's twisted tale. Every victim, every disappearance, every scene, they were all laid out in sequence. And in the center of the table sat a script, bound in red leather, titled The Final Girl. Inside, Helen Cross's name was written on the dedication page: Victor. Dane was never found. The cabin was deserted, scrubbed clean of any forensic trace. But what they discovered was enough to confirm what Cross had feared. The entire 9-year nightmare had been one man's magnum opus. He had crafted each event as part of a living screenplay, with real people as his actors, and death as his punctuation. The police closed the case quietly. Officially, Victor Dane was named as the prime suspect. Unofficially, Cross knew the truth. The killer had written his story to the end and exited the stage on his own terms. No applause, no curtain call, just silence. To this day, the full reel remains sealed in evidence, never shown to the public. And Helen Cross, now retired, lives under a new name, always watching, always waiting. Because even after 9 years of horror, she knows one thing for certain: stories like these don't end. They pause, they wait. And sometimes the killer isn't finished telling them.